What if I told you that the most dangerous form of control is not violence, threats, or force? What if the greatest changes in your life happen so slowly that you never noticed them happening at all? No one willingly walks into a prison. No one consciously chooses to surrender their freedom, accept disrespect, tolerate manipulation, or abandon who they truly are. Yet every day, millions of people do exactly that, without realizing it, not because they are weak, not because they are foolish, but because of a psychological force so subtle, so patient, and so invisible that it rarely triggers alarm until the damage is already done. It begins with something small. A compromise, a justification, a boundary crossed just once, then another, and another. Each step seems harmless on its own. Each concession feels temporary. Each warning sign appears insignificant. Until one day you look around and realize you are living in a reality you would have rejected years ago. This is the slow poison. The dark law that transforms the unacceptable into the normal, the shocking into the ordinary, and the dangerous into something that feels familiar. It is how toxic relationships are built, how manipulation takes root, how institutions gain control, how entire societies drift toward outcomes that once seemed impossible. And the most disturbing part, the process often feels natural while it is happening. In the chapters ahead, you will uncover the hidden mechanisms behind the slow poison, the psychological principles that allow people, groups, and systems to reshape your perception without your awareness. You will learn why intelligent people fall victim to it, why it is so effective, and how to recognize its presence before it quietly rewrites your life. Because once you see the slow poison, you begin to notice it everywhere, and after that, you can never unsee it. Introduction. Before we go any further, we need to understand the psychological mechanism at the heart of this book. A mechanism so powerful, so subtle, and so deeply woven into human nature that it can reshape beliefs, relationships, institutions, and even entire societies without most people ever noticing it. It is called incremental normalization. At its simplest, incremental normalization is the process by which the extraordinary becomes ordinary, the shocking becomes familiar, the unacceptable becomes expected, not through dramatic events, not through sudden force, but through a series of small changes, each one seemingly harmless on its own. Human beings rarely judge their circumstances against an absolute standard. Instead, they compare today to yesterday. They compare the present moment to what they have already accepted. And when the baseline shifts even slightly, the mind quickly adjusts. What once felt wrong begins to feel tolerable. What once felt tolerable begins to feel normal. And what once felt normal is eventually forgotten altogether. This process depends on three powerful psychological forces. The first is gradualism. Changes arrive slowly, one step at a time, small enough to avoid resistance. Each individual step seems insignificant, making it easy to overlook the direction in which the path is leading. The second is habituation. The human brain is designed to adapt. What is repeated long enough stops feeling unusual. What remains constant fades into the background of awareness. Over time, even harmful conditions can begin to feel ordinary simply because they are familiar. The third is rationalization. Once people accept a new reality, they instinctively search for reasons to justify it. The mind prefers consistency over contradiction. Rather than admitting that something has changed for the worse, it often creates explanations that make the new situation seem reasonable, necessary, or unavoidable. Together, these forces form one of the most powerful psychological patterns in human behavior. They can alter perception so completely that people lose sight of their original standards. They forget what they once believed. They defend what they once opposed. They adapt to circumstances they would have rejected without hesitation only a few years earlier. This book is for those who want to understand how that transformation happens. It is for those who want to see clearly beneath the surface of relationships, workplaces, social systems, and even their own minds. It is for anyone who has ever looked around and wondered when things changed and why so few people seem to notice. Most importantly, it is for those who want to develop genuine awareness. Not paranoia, not cynicism, but the ability to recognize when the baseline is shifting, when the poison is spreading, and when something dangerous is slowly becoming normal. Because the moment you understand how incremental normalization works, you begin to see it everywhere, and once you see it, you gain the power to resist it. Part 1. The Anatomy of the Slow Poison. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Gradual Change. Every major shift in human experience, whether personal or civilizational, is built from small steps. This is not a bug in the system. It is a feature that manipulators, whether conscious or not, learn to exploit with devastating precision. How baselines are built. The human brain does not experience the world directly. It experiences a model of the world that it has constructed from accumulated experience. The baseline, the sense of what is normal, acceptable, and expected, is not fixed. It is continuously updated based on what the brain has most recently experienced. This is why a person who has lived in a noisy city no longer notices traffic sounds that would keep a rural visitor awake at night. The brain has recalibrated. The noise has been absorbed into the baseline. What was once a stimulus is now background. Manipulators, whether relationship abusers, cult leaders, or authoritarian governments, understand this recalibration process intuitively. They do not demand compliance with their final state immediately. They request a first step so small it barely registers, and then another, and another. The escalation ladder. The escalation ladder is the core tool of incremental normalization. It has 4 rungs. The entry point, a request or condition so reasonable that refusal seems unreasonable. The creep. Small additions and extensions, each individually justifiable. The lock-in. The moment when the cumulative change is significant enough to have altered the person's identity, investments, or circumstances. The reveal. The point at which the final state, now accepted, would have been rejected at the outset. Compliance is not demanded. It is grown. Historical signatures of the escalation ladder. The escalation ladder appears consistently across history's most disturbing transformations. The Nuremberg laws were not the first demand made of German citizens in the 1930s. They were the culmination of years of gradually escalating restrictions, each one making the next slightly more acceptable. Domestic abusers do not begin relationships with violence. They begin with charm, followed by small criticisms, followed by minor jealousies, each step normalizing the next. Understanding this architecture is the first and most fundamental step in developing immunity to it. Chapter 2. The Neuroscience of New Normal. The slow poison is not merely a social phenomenon. It is rooted in the biological architecture of the human brain. Understanding the neuroscience of normalization is essential to understanding why intelligent, aware, well-intentioned people are so susceptible to it. Habituation, the brain's most powerful cost-cutter. Habituation is the neurological process by which the brain reduces its response to stimuli that are repeated without consequence. It is one of the most ancient and universal features of nervous systems, found in organisms as simple as sea slugs. From an evolutionary standpoint, habituation is brilliantly efficient. It allows the brain to reserve its alertness and energy for novel stimuli, the things most likely to signal threats or opportunities, while ignoring the constant and familiar. The problem is that the brain does not distinguish between constant background noise and constant abuse. Both get habituated, both get normalized. The anchor bias and baseline drift. Psychological research consistently demonstrates that human judgment is profoundly anchored to reference points. Once a reference point is established, it is extraordinarily difficult to evaluate subsequent information independently of it. When baselines shift gradually, the anchoring effect means that each new position becomes the reference point for evaluating the next step. The person is no longer comparing their current situation to where they began. They are comparing it to where they were last week. This is how radical departures from original values are made invisible. The role of cognitive dissonance. When people have already accepted a previous step, accepting the next step requires less psychological work than acknowledging that the first step was a mistake. Cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs, drives people to rationalize each successive step rather than audit the entire trajectory. The greatest ally of the slow poison is the human mind's desperate need to believe that its past choices were correct. Chapter 3. The 3 phases of normalization. While every instance of incremental normalization has its unique characteristics, the process consistently follows 3 recognizable phases. Understanding these phases is the foundation of early detection. Phase 1. The seduction of reasonableness. The first phase of normalization is defined by requests and conditions that are genuinely, or at least plausibly, reasonable. This is the phase in which the escalation ladder is entered. The critical feature of this phase is that resistance to entry seems disproportionate, paranoid, or socially costly. In abusive relationships, this phase presents as intense romantic investment, attentiveness, and care. In authoritarian political systems, it presents as appeals to national security, economic necessity, or social order. In toxic workplaces, it presents as reasonable performance standards and team loyalty. The content changes, the structure is always the same. Phase 2. The creep. The second phase is characterized by incremental extension, small additions to what has already been accepted, each framed as a minor natural or temporary expansion of the existing arrangement. This is the phase in which the most critical work of normalization happens, and it is also the phase most invisible to those experiencing it. The changes are small enough to seem acceptable in isolation. The cumulative shift is large enough to be catastrophic. But because the person is always evaluating step N against step N1, rather than against the original baseline, the magnitude of the total change is obscured. Phase 3. The lock-in. The third phase is reached when the cumulative changes have created conditions that make exit psychologically, practically, or socially costly. By this point, the person's identity, investments, relationships, or circumstances have become entangled with the normalized situation. This is the phase at which the frog is in hot water. Reversal is not impossible, but it requires confronting not just the current situation, but the entire history of acceptance that led to it, which means acknowledging that earlier choices were mistakes. This is among the most difficult things the human psyche is capable of. Part 2. Where the poison is deployed. Chapter 4. Intimate relationships. The boiling frog in love. The domain in which incremental normalization causes perhaps its most intimate damage is that of close personal relationships. The slow poison is the operational mechanism behind most forms of intimate partner abuse, coercive control, and relational erosion. The cycle of gradual escalation in abusive relationships. Research on intimate partner violence consistently shows that abuse rarely begins with physical violence. It begins with control, and control begins with care, checking in frequently, expressing concern about a partner's friends, questioning their decisions gently. These early behaviors are often experienced as signs of investment and love. Each step, from frequent check-ins to location tracking, from gentle questioning to explosive criticism, from social concern to social isolation, is presented as a natural extension of the last. Each is small enough to seem acceptable relative to what has already been accepted. The cumulative destination was never chosen. How love accelerates normalization. Emotional attachment dramatically accelerates the process of normalization. When we love someone, we are motivated to interpret their behavior charitably. We explain away red flags. We attribute escalating control to anxiety, trauma, or love. We reframe boundary violations as signs of intensity. The attachment system, the neurological and emotional architecture that bonds us to others, was not designed to evaluate whether a relationship is healthy. It was designed to preserve attachment. In the presence of incremental harm, it reliably preserves the attachment and normalizes the harm. Case anatomy. A relationship under the slow poison. Month 1, he texts constantly. She finds it sweet. Month 6, he becomes upset when she doesn't reply within minutes. She apologizes and replies faster. Month 12, she no longer makes plans without checking with him first. She no longer remembers when this began. This composite portrait, drawn from clinical and research literature on coercive control, illustrates the signature of the slow poison. No single step that seemed unjustifiable, a destination that was never chosen, an erosion so gradual that even the person experiencing it cannot fully account for it. Non-abusive normalization. Drift in otherwise healthy relationships. It is important to note that normalization does not only occur in abusive contexts. Even healthy relationships drift. Standards for communication, intimacy, effort and respect can erode gradually in relationships where no one has malicious intent. The slow poison does not require a deliberate poisoner to operate. Chapter 5. The workplace. How organizations erode boundaries. The modern workplace is one of the most fertile for incremental normalization. The structural dynamics of employment, hierarchy, financial dependency, social identification, and gradual expectation creep combine to make workplace normalization both common and particularly difficult to resist. The employment entry point. Every employment relationship begins with an explicit contract and an implicit one. The explicit contract specifies compensation and responsibilities. The implicit contract, the unspoken expectations around availability, commitment, sacrifice, and loyalty, and is articulated at the outset and is subsequently expanded incrementally. Expectation creep. How above and beyond becomes the floor. Organizations routinely use exceptional performance as a new baseline. An employee who voluntarily works additional hours during a critical project finds that the hours are no longer voluntary. An employee who is responsive outside business hours finds that responsiveness is now expected. The exceptional becomes ordinary, the ordinary becomes inadequate, and the inadequate becomes grounds for sanction. Culture normalization. How toxic becomes just how it is here. Organizational culture is perhaps the most powerful vehicle for workplace normalization because it is collectively enforced and socially invisible to those inside it. Bullying leadership styles, exclusionary dynamics, ethical compromises, and exploitative practices all become normalized when they are consistent, when they are engaged in by respected figures, and when dissent carries social costs. The most common response to toxic organizational culture is not protest. It is adaptation, until the person no longer remembers what a healthy environment felt like. Chapter 6. Political Regimes. How Tyranny Arrives on Tiptoe. The history of authoritarianism is, in large part, a history of incremental normalization. No democratic society has ever moved directly from open governance to tyranny in a single step. The transition always happens gradually, through laws that seem reasonable in isolation, through emergencies that justify temporary exceptions, through rhetoric that shifts the boundaries of the acceptable so slowly that the shift goes unmarked. The salamiification of rights. Political scientists use the term salami tactics to describe the strategy of removing rights and freedoms one thin slice at a time. Each slice too small to provoke organized resistance, the cumulative removal catastrophic. This is the slow poison operating at civilizational scale. The role of emergency and exception. One of the most reliable vehicles for political normalization is the emergency exception. Extraordinary measures, justified by crisis, are implemented as temporary. The crisis passes, the measures remain. The temporary exception becomes the permanent framework. And because each extension is framed as a continuation of what has already been accepted, resistance is difficult to mobilize. Rhetoric as a normalization tool. Language shifts are among the most reliable early indicators of political normalization. When terminology evolves to render the previously unacceptable not just acceptable but virtuous. When surveillance becomes security, detention becomes protective custody, and suppression of dissent becomes maintaining order. The conceptual baseline has already been moved. The behavior follows the language. 4 historical case studies. The Weimar Republic to the Third Reich, 13 years of incremental normalization. Hungary's democratic backsliding 2010 to 2022. The post-9/11 expansion of surveillance states in liberal democracies. The gradual normalization of political corruption in systems with weak institutions. Chapter 7. Cults, Communities, and Group Identity. Cultic organizations are, in a sense, laboratories of incremental normalization. They have refined the process of baseline shifting to a precise art. But the mechanisms they employ are not unique to fringe groups. They operate wherever strong group identity, social pressure, and gradual demand escalation combine. The foot in the door of belief. Cult recruitment does not begin with the demands that define full membership. It begins with ideas and requests so reasonable that refusal would seem closed-minded. Meditation practices, community events, philosophical discussions. The entry point is always innocuous. The escalation follows the lock-in of identity and social investment. Demand escalation and identity merger. As commitment deepens, demands escalate. Financial contributions, time commitments, and behavioral restrictions increase incrementally. Each new demand is presented as a natural expression of a belief system the person has already adopted. By the time the demands are extreme, the person's identity, community, and worldview are so thoroughly entangled with the group that exit carries catastrophic psychological cost. The group as a normalization engine. The power of collective normalization cannot be overstated. When a new member observes that people they respect have accepted a particular demand or belief without apparent distress, the normalization pressure is multiplied. Social proof, the tendency to treat others' behavior as evidence of what is correct and acceptable, makes group environments dramatically more effective at shifting baselines than individual manipulation. Chapter 8. Digital Life. How Algorithms Shift Your Baseline. The digital environment in which most contemporary human life is embedded represents a new and uniquely powerful vector for incremental normalization. Algorithmic systems designed to maximize engagement are, by their structure, systems that continuously push content slightly beyond the current threshold of stimulation, normalizing each level of intensity in order to demand the next. The engagement ratchet. Engagement algorithms do not serve the user's interests. They serve the metric of continued attention. Content that generates strong emotional responses, outrage, fear, arousal, tribal activation, generates more engagement than content that is accurate, nuanced, or constructive. Algorithms learn this and optimize accordingly. The result is a systematic escalation of the emotional and ideological intensity of the content users are served. Each level of intensity is normalized, and the algorithm pushes to the next. The baseline of what seems normal, what seems threatening, and what seems like the enemy shifts continuously and invisibly. The normalization of surveillance. The gradual expansion of digital surveillance, location tracking, behavioral profiling, biometric data collection represents one of the most significant examples of societal normalization in recent history. Each expansion was incremental. Each was exchanged for convenience, and the cumulative result, a surveillance infrastructure of a scope that would have seemed dystopian a generation ago, now barely registers as a concern for most users. Social media and the normalization of performance. Social media platforms have incrementally normalized levels of self-disclosure, public performance of identity, and social comparison that would have been psychologically unrecognizable to previous generations. The personal costs of these normalizations, in anxiety, identity instability, and relational dysfunction, are substantial and largely invisible because they are universal. Part 3. The Psychology of the Poisoned. Chapter 9. Why Smart People Fall for It. Intelligence does not protect against incremental normalization. In some respects, it accelerates it. The more sophisticated a person's capacity for rationalization, the more effectively they can construct justifications for each successive step. The more self-aware they are, the more they trust that they would recognize genuine danger, a trust the slow poison reliably exploits. The paradox of self-awareness. People who believe themselves to be perceptive and resistant to manipulation are, paradoxically, often more susceptible to gradual processes precisely because they trust their ability to detect danger. This confidence can suppress the very vigilance that would alert them to incremental drift. Rationalization as intelligence's dark side. Higher cognitive capacity enables more sophisticated rationalization. For every step of the slow poison, an intelligent person can generate a more compelling justification, one nuanced enough to silence doubt and sophisticated enough to be self-convincing. Intelligence, weaponized by motivated reasoning, becomes an engine of self-deception. The role of empathy in accelerating normalization. High empathy individuals are particularly susceptible to relational normalization because they are strongly motivated to understand and excuse the behavior of those they care about. Empathy creates a continuous supply of context, nuance, and charitable interpretation that can be exploited step by step. Chapter 10. The Sunk Cost Trap. Among the psychological mechanisms that sustain incremental normalization, few are more powerful than the sunk cost effect. The human tendency to continue investing in a situation because of what has already been invested in it, rather than on the basis of its current and future value. How sunk costs seal normalizations. By the time normalization reaches phase 3, the lock-in, the person has typically invested years, identity, relationships, or resources in the situation. Acknowledging that the current state is unacceptable requires acknowledging that these investments were made in the service of something harmful or false. The cognitive and emotional cost of this acknowledgement is immense. The double bind of invested identity. When personal identity has been constructed around a relationship, an organization, or a belief system, leaving requires not just exiting a situation, but dismantling a self. This is not a rational calculation about costs and benefits. It is a threat to psychological survival. And threats to psychological survival are resisted more ferociously than threats to physical survival in many circumstances. Chapter 11. The Identity Merger. When the cage becomes home. The final and most complete stage of personal normalization is the identity merger, the point at which the person can no longer distinguish between themselves and the situation that has captured them. The relationship, the organization, the ideology. It is no longer something they are in. It is something they are. How identity gets absorbed. Identity absorption happens through the mechanisms of the slow poison over time. As the person invests more, accepts more, defends more, they construct an ever larger portion of their self-concept around the situation. They begin to see the world through its framework, use its language, define their values by its standards. Why external intervention fails at this stage. This is why well-meaning attempts to extract someone from a cult, an abusive relationship, or a toxic ideology so often fail. The external observer is not just challenging the situation, they are challenging the person's identity. The response is not, "Thank you for showing me the truth." The response is, "You don't understand, and you are attacking me." You cannot rescue someone from a cage they experience as a home. First, they must remember that they existed before the cage was built. Part 4. The Poisoners. Who does this and why? Chapter 12. The Deliberate Architect versus the Unconscious Drifter. A critical and frequently misunderstood dimension of incremental normalization is the question of intentionality. Is the slow poison always deliberately deployed? The answer is not always, and perhaps not even usually, but the effect is the same regardless of intent. The Deliberate Architect. Some practitioners of the slow poison are fully conscious of what they are doing. They understand that their desired end state would be rejected if presented immediately. They plan their escalation ladder. They monitor compliance and calibrate their next step accordingly. This profile is most common in certain forms of intimate partner abuse, cult leadership, and deliberate political manipulation. The unconscious drifter. Far more common is the person who is not consciously engineering normalization, but whose needs, fears, and patterns lead them to escalate demands incrementally as a matter of psychological reflex. The controlling partner who was themselves traumatized. The demanding manager who experienced the same demands as normal. The institution that has never examined its own cultural patterns. Why the distinction matters less than expected. From the perspective of the person experiencing normalization, the distinction between deliberate and unconscious escalation is often less important than it appears. The effect, a systematic shift in baseline, an erosion of standards, a gradual acceptance of the unacceptable, is the same in both cases. Understanding the poisoner's intent can be valuable for predicting their behavior, but it is not necessary for identifying or resisting the slow poison. Chapter 13. Profiles in escalation, narcissists, abusers, authoritarians. While the slow poison can operate without a deliberate architect, certain psychological profiles are associated with its most systematic and damaging forms. Understanding these profiles is not an exercise in demonization. It is a practical tool for pattern recognition. The narcissistic escalation pattern. Individuals with narcissistic traits are particularly prone to incremental normalization because their needs for admiration, control, and priority are insatiable. The escalation ladder in narcissistic relationships moves predictably from idealization to gradual devaluation to full control, with each phase normalized by what preceded it. The authoritarian escalation pattern. Authoritarian personalities, whether in political leadership, organizational management, or family systems, follow a characteristic pattern of incremental demand escalation combined with systematic punishment of resistance and reward of compliance. This combination is particularly effective at accelerating normalization because it creates both push and pull toward acceptance. The institutional escalation pattern. Institutions, companies, governments, religious organizations, educational systems normalize the intolerable through mechanisms that are often structural rather than personal. Bureaucratic inertia, collective responsibility diffusion, and the gradual raising of performance and compliance standards can produce normalization effects as damaging as those produced by individual manipulators. Chapter 14. Systemic poison. When institutions normalize the intolerable. Perhaps the most challenging form of incremental normalization to resist is systemic normalization, the process by which entire societies, cultures, come to accept conditions that, examined from the outside or from an earlier vantage point, are clearly intolerable. The normalization of economic violence. The gradual normalization of economic conditions, working hours, job insecurity, wage stagnation, healthcare inaccessibility, that previous generations would have found unacceptable represents a systemic slow poison operating across decades. Each deterioration is incremental enough to be absorbed. The cumulative result is a transformed set of expectations about what constitutes an acceptable life. The normalization of information pollution. The gradual degradation of information quality through the normalization of misinformation, the erosion of journalistic standards, the algorithmically driven spread of outrage content has shifted the epistemic baseline of entire societies. What would have been recognized as propaganda or fabrication a generation ago is now received as standard political content. Resisting systemic normalization. Resisting systemic normalization is the most difficult form of resistance described in this book because it requires maintaining a perspective that is, by definition, at odds with the surrounding culture. The tools for doing so are the same as those for resisting personal normalization, but their application requires a community of shared reference points. Part 5. The Antidote. Chapter 15. The Anchor Practice. Defining your baseline. The most effective defense against the slow poison is also the simplest. The deliberate, explicit establishment of a baseline, a clear, written, remembered record of your standards, values, and non-negotiables, that you return to regularly and that functions as an anchor against drift. Why anchors work. The vulnerability that the slow poison exploits is the absence of a stable, accessible reference point outside the current situation. When your only reference is yesterday, incremental drift is invisible. When you have a clear anchor, a document, a statement, a set of principles defined before the drift began, the drift becomes visible. How? To create your anchor. The anchor practice involves 4 steps. Define your non-negotiables in writing, the conditions below which a relationship, job or commitment is not acceptable to you, stated specifically and in positive terms, and you date and store this document outside the primary environment you are monitoring. Establish a regular schedule for reviewing it. quarterly at minimum. Compare your current reality to your stated standards, not to last week's reality. The anchor practice in collective settings. Organizations, communities, and societies can implement analogous anchor practices through the regular public reaffirmation of founding values, the explicit tracking of metric baselines, and the institutionalization of retrospective comparison, asking not, "Is this better than last year?" but "Is this consistent with where we decided to be?" Chapter 16. The Snapshot Technique. Seeing change across time, the snapshot technique is a complement to the anchor practice. Where the anchor provides a fixed reference point defined in advance, the snapshot technique creates a series of time-stamped records of current reality that can be compared across intervals. The basic snapshot. The core practice is simple. At regular intervals, write an honest description of your current situation in a specified domain, a relationship, a workplace, a political environment. Include what you are accepting, what you are tolerating, what you have stopped doing that you once did, and what you have started doing that you once would not have. These snapshots, read in sequence, make the trajectory of change visible. The single most common response of people who practice the snapshot technique is, "I did not realize how much had changed." The comparison protocol. Every 6 months, compare the current snapshot to the one from 12 months prior, not 6 months prior. The 6-month interval is often too small to reveal significant drift. The 12-month comparison reliably makes the direction and magnitude of change visible. The slow poison is only invisible in the present. In the past tense, it is always obvious. Chapter 17. Reversing the Normalization. Reclaiming your original reality. The most difficult work in this entire field is the work of reversal. Identifying the slow poison is hard. Accepting that it has operated is harder. Actively reversing the normalization it has created, reclaiming the standards, values, and identity that preceded it, is the hardest of all. The non-linear nature of recovery. Recovery from significant normalization is not a straight line. It involves a sequential process of re-exposure to the original baseline, which typically produces significant cognitive dissonance before it produces clarity. The person who is recovering from long-term relational normalization may oscillate between their restored original perspective and the normalized perspective for an extended period. The role of external reference points in reversal, because normalization by definition involves the corruption of internal reference points. Recovery almost always requires external ones. Trusted people who knew the person before the normalization began. Documented evidence of the original baseline. Communities of people who share the pre-normalization standard. These external reference points provide the scaffolding within which internal restoration can occur. Practical step in reversal. Name what happened. Articulate the specific process of normalization and the specific steps it followed. Reconstruct the original baseline using the anchor practice and any available historical evidence. Identify the specific standards that were eroded and make explicit commitments to their restoration. Create accountability structures, people and practices that will alert you if the drift begins again. Treat reversal as a process, not an event. The normalization took time. The restoration will too. Chapter 18. Building immunity, hardwiring resistance. The ultimate goal of this book is not just to help you identify or recover from the slow poison. It is to help you build genuine resistance to it, a set of habits, practices, and dispositions that make incremental normalization significantly harder to accomplish against you. The resistance mindset. resistance to incremental normalization begins with a fundamental shift in how you evaluate change. The resistant mindset does not ask only, "Is this acceptable?" It asks, "Is this consistent with my established baseline? Is this where the current trajectory is heading? If this rate of change continues for 12 months, where will I be?" The 5 core resistance practices: regular baseline review, the anchor practice and snapshot technique, maintained consistently. Trajectory thinking, always evaluating current conditions in the context of their direction, not just their current position. Resistance to urgency, a deliberate pause before accepting any new demand or condition, regardless of the pressure to decide immediately. Pattern literacy, familiarity with the signatures of incremental normalization across the contexts described in this book. Community of accountability, trusted people who know your baseline and have explicit permission to tell you when they observe drift. Teaching resistance. The slow poison is most effective against those who have never been taught that it exists. The most powerful form of immunity is education. People who understand the mechanism are significantly more resistant to it. This is not because knowledge prevents the neurological processes of habituation and baseline shift. It does not. It is because knowledge provides the vocabulary and framework to name what is happening, which is the first and most essential step in resisting it. You cannot fight what you cannot name. Name it every time, from the first step. Epilogue. The day you see it clearly. There comes a moment, if you do the work in this book, when you see it, not in a dramatic revelation, but in a quiet, terrible clarity. You look at your current reality, and you look at your original baseline, and you understand fully what happened in between. This moment is not comfortable. It contains grief for what was lost, anger at what was done, and frequently some measure of shame at having not seen it sooner. All of these responses are appropriate. None of them are permanent. What comes after the clarity is the work, the naming, the reconstruction, the restoration. And eventually, if you build the practices described in this book into the fabric of your daily life, something more valuable than comfort, the ability to see the temperature of the water you are in real time before it becomes enough to damage. The frog, the story goes, does not jump because it cannot sense the gradual change. You are not a frog. You have language, memory, the capacity for reflection, and now a map of exactly how the heating happens. Jump when you need to, and build the practices that ensure you will always know when you need to.